Good morning. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and above all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this event today. I think it's a great honor to have been invited to speak at this event for you, Elda. And I was very happy to accept this invitation because also a nice opportunity to see Elda again. Last time we met was some years ago, and time is flying. I retired 2 years ago, and I can assure you, so it's nice. So some of the chores are no longer there, but you can also have the leisure to continue with the research and meet people at conferences. So the good things will carry on, and other good things will come, and the less good things will disappear. Or you have the pleasure to say no to things you don't want to do anymore. The topic of the conference, Discourse, Pragmatics, Translation, covers very well the area of research which Elda has been involved in. And my own field is translation and interpreting, which are also seen as social activities. And as social activities, translating, interpreting always takes place in the social context, and contexts are also marked by positions of power. And they're also subject to the intervention of various agents. So not only the translator, but there are the commissioner, the clients, editors, publishing houses, and so on, academia as well. So I personally was very much inspired by Elda's work on positioning in media dialogue. So this monograph she published in 2008, where she talked about positioning that in dialogue, in dialogic interaction, interactional and social roles and identities are established. And so this differentiation between the interactional role and the social role. And also, as she says here, positioning involves assignment, shaping, and negotiations of reciprocal relations between all parties involved in the interaction. So this is something which, when I read this book, I thought, well, that's really very interesting, because interaction or interviews are not always just dialogues, because very often an interview is interpreted. So you have a triadic interaction, because you have the interviewer, the interviewee, and in the middle is the interpreter who mediates between the two. So interviewing as a triadic exchange. And examples I've looked at were also kind of political interviews and also political press conferences, which very often are also mediated by interpreters. So at an international state visit, for example, the politicians give a press conference at the end, so where the host and the visiting politician give speeches, and then they can answer questions from the audience, and the audience in these cases here, journalists. And also, as Anita Fetzer-Peter-Bull said in one of their papers, it's not only the politicians who perform political actions in the published mediatized area, but also the interpreters are part of they also perform in this mediatized arena. So interpreting also is a kind of performance. Just to give you two examples here, so this is a press conference which the German Chancellor Merkel and the French President Macron had. And you can see Merkel wears headphones, so this is a case where simultaneous interpreting is happening. Yeah, so the interpreter interprets at the same time as one of the speakers is speaking here. And in other cases, smaller settings, we will have normally consecutive interpreting, what we experienced just a few minutes ago. But here you also see it's a very closed environment. Yeah, so you have politicians, Obama and Hollande, with other political advisors sitting there as well, and the interpreters sitting next to the politicians. So no headphones therefore, and they have their notes where note-taking can happen. So questions which I was interested in then were, what are the consequences of interpreter-mediated encounters for the positioning of the participants? And what are the consequences of interpreter-mediated encounters for the construction of interactional and social roles and identities? So questions which Elda had addressed in the book, but applying them to interpreter-mediated context, particular interviews and press conferences. So it's not so easy to get access to your data, because very often as a researcher you cannot be present, at least at all at these meetings where Obama meets Hollande. So when they are sitting there in their offices, there's no space for a researcher to observe and to record. Similarly with press conferences. So in some cases, press conferences or interviews are transmitted live on TV or on the internet these days where you can watch. But then you do not see all the participants, you cannot hear all the participants because the interpreter's voice is sometimes only audible to the politician for whom the interpreting happens. So if you watch a press conference, you may hear the voice of the interpreter, but only into your native language if they interpret the speaker, the foreign speaker. So you can get, these days also thanks to the internet, you can have recordings or videos of interviews, press conferences. You can have reports in newspapers about the conference. You may also get a full transcript of a press conference or of an interview on the website of the governments. If you have press conference of two politicians from different countries, you may even find one complete transcript in one language on the website of the one government and a complete transcript on the website of the other government. So you have the two languages, but kind of separate recordings or separate transcripts here. So whenever translation and interpreting is involved, then the complexity is even more complex. So you can have transcripts, as I said, in different languages which you can compare. Yeah? But it doesn't say in the transcript, it doesn't indicate explicitly when the recording is the voice of the interpreter or when the recording is the voice of the politician. Is there some echo in the, don't know whether I need to get closer, more away from the microphone. Is it better when I stand back? No, it's independent of where I'm standing. It's because I noticed, I felt that it was a bit like an echo coming back. Okay, good. But I mean, the question here I had is, when I want to do this kind of research into interpreter-mediated interviews or press conference, so what are the data I can use as my input? And the data are sometimes incomplete or they have undergone further editing processes. For example, if a news report about a press conference happens. I will show you some examples. Oops. It's gone.
Is it?
There was some clicking noise.
I think your voice is actually loud enough without the mic. Actually, some of the people there spoke without the mic, and it's perfectly okay.
But can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So then I try to speak. Okay. So when we talk about translation and interpreting research, also the whole discipline of translation studies has developed over the time. So there is no one standard definition of translation or interpreting, and we have seen the development here because traditionally interpreting or translation were seen as processes of linguistic transcoding. You have some text or some message in one language and it's reproduced in an equivalent fashion in the other language. So you transcode one message into another message. This was the kind of original definition in the 60s when research into translation began to be developed. And we have translation studies as an independent discipline since the 1970s, roughly. So it's still a very young and growing and flourishing discipline. We had then in the 1970s a development, what we refer to as functionalist approaches to translation, where translation was seen not as a purely linguistic transcoding activity, but as a form of action, transcultural action, and when we produce a text, we do it for a particular purpose. So Hans Vermeer's corpus theory is an example here. We then have Gideon Toury, who is very well known here. I don't need to say much more, with his norms-based approach, saying translation is social behavior. Translators act in a particular social context, and there are social norms of what we understand translation to be and what translators are doing. So translation as socially contexted behavior, as norm-based behavior. And then in the 1990s, we have a further widening of the perspective of translation, looking at it as a social political act, a cultural political practice, as Lawrence Venuti defined it, and more recent approaches to translation also being inspired by sociology, also talk about translation as socially regulated behavior. So these different perspectives, so from an initially more narrow focus on language to the wider context of social, cultural interaction context, various agents, their interests, their purposes involved, also had an influence on how we see the role of the translator and interpreter in these turns in translation studies, as Mary Hesnell Hornby called them. So where traditionally, when you just see translation is a case of linguistic transcoding, in these initial texts, the translator was not really problematized. So it was kind of invisible. So there was no explicit discussion about what is the role of the translator, what are translators doing. So unless statements like a translator must never deviate or a translator must produce a message faithfully to the source text, you are kind of subservient to the original text or subservient to what the original author wanted to say. So with the functionalist approaches, you have a kind of a turn to translator as experts, translators as experts in their own right, namely being experts in intercultural communication, who cooperate with the other clients. So a kind of empowerment of the translator becoming more visible. With the cultural turns where you can discuss about where there were really turns in the discipline, I would rather say it's a kind of changing perspectives and an enlargement of the view, so not so much now we all march into one direction, then we turn to the right, and we all march into the other. So it's much more complex in the development. But with this cultural turn in the 1990s, there was also more attention given to translators and interpreters, saying they function in a particular social context. So this social context, the political context, the ideological context also has an impact on what translators are doing. So translators also have become more visible, or as Venuti said, you have to be visible as a translator also in the text by showing that the text people read is a translation and not something which could have been written in the original language. So they refer to translators as engaged interventionists. You always intervene in this mediated discourse, and you should do this in a particular engaged way. And also what has recently been done in the field of activism, so activist translators, very often volunteer translators, interpreters as well, comes into this aspect of looking at the age of translators as agents of the interaction. And with the sociological turn, also the habitus of translators has been investigated using concepts of Bourdieu's like capital. So what is the social capital of translators? What's the economic capital? How does this compare to the capital and the habitus of the other interactants in a translation event? So there was a book, quite interesting book, published in 2002 by Edwin Gensler, Maria Timoshko, or edited by them, which is called Translation and Power. And I quite like this quote here. Translators must make choices, selecting aspects or part of a text to transpose and emphasize. Such choices, in turn, serve to create representations of their source text, representations that are also partial. This partiality is an aspect that makes the act of translation partisan, engaged and committed, either implicitly or explicitly. So that's what I meant with the engaged interventionist, which the translator has, or the commitment. And this partial nature of translation is what makes them also an exercise of power. So also translators, interpreters have a certain amount of power, which can be more or less explicit, and also depending on the context, the type of text, the genre they're working with, And there are also difference whether it is translation or interpreting in these respects. So also translators, interpreters make decisions. They have to make decisions. And they are also, as individuals, they also, their decisions depend on their own, the translators, interpreters' own social, political, ideological, and ethical positions. The situational, contextual, institutional context in which they are working. So when you think of translation and interpreting, you have seen the interpreting case here, you don't have the same amount of time for doing the research than you have for translation. So as interpreting, you have to say something immediately, which is even more immediate when you have the simultaneous interpreting mode, because when you're taking notes, some thinking is already happening. How will I express certain things? So there's also a form of translators, interpreters positioning. We position ourselves by making these choices, by opting for how do I express certain things. And if there are some kinds of political sensitive issues, also as a translator, interpreter, when you are trained for it, you kind of listen out for certain things, and you are also very often aware that there are some kind of tricky, sensitive issues where you have to take a certain decision, and which is for interpreting, it has to come on the spot. There's also sometimes when in interpreting your research, you see an interpreter has said something, and then immediately it's followed by a kind of synonym. Yeah? So it's also an aspect of self-monitoring where you say, oh, I've realized maybe some other word would have been better. So for translation, since normally you have a bit more time, you can check out something. There is a revision process before a translation gets published. There are revisers, editors, proofreaders, which is not the case for interpreting. It's set once and there it is. In particular with interviews, press conferences, I will show you in a minute. It's the interpreter's word gets recorded and sent out in the world. So here you have a small audience, but if you have a political press conference, which is transmitted live on TV, the world is listening and they hear the interpreter. So you can't say, wait a minute, I'm the interpreter, I want to check something in the dictionary. No way. So there's always also something like what you might want to call reflexive positioning. Yeah? So where the speaker may identify him or herself as translator, as interpreter. So in public service interpreting context, this may happen when the interpreter is working consecutively, but you can say, well, now I speak as the interpreter, or can you please slow down? So you can position yourself in a way where you say, well, this is something which, or changing from the first person to the third person, saying, so it's kind of signal, I distance myself. In translation, also sometimes you have translators' notes, where translators explain certain decisions, which is also a kind of positioning, a kind of reflexive positioning. We say, I've realized something, or maybe the norm expects me to do this, but I have opted for something else, and you provide a translator's note as a footnote to give a kind of explanation. So, as that my interest then was in these interpreter-mediated press conferences from the perspective of what happens to the interaction of the social roles. But then I was also thinking about, well, it's not the end. There's a press conference and it happens, but most people hear about a press conference by reading the media. So there are further recontextualization processes when then journalists write an article, a news report, about this particular political event which had happened. So what happens there in these further processes in respect of positioning, role, identity construction? Who are the agents in this respect? So it's not the translators, interpreters anymore, they have done their job, but then it's other people who are carrying on with the discourse. So what motivates, what empowers them? And what role does translation play in these contexts of media reports about a particular political event? In the book which Elda and Anita edited on the follow-ups, in Discourse I had looked at a press conference which the former President Obama and the former Chinese President Hu had back in 2000. When was it? 2010? 11. So because it was also interpreter mediated, and there were also news reports about this particular press conference. So this press conference was done in a simultaneous mode. So Obama spoke in English. You could see the Chinese president wearing the headphones, had the interpreting into Chinese, and then the Chinese speaker was reading out his prepared statement, simultaneous interpreting into English. So then when the question and answer session started, there was quite a bit of confusion, because then there was no simultaneous interpreting anymore, and the question had been asked to both Obama and the Chinese president, and then Obama answered, and then there was kind of silence. And then you would hear a voice, the Chinese was saying, the question is translated, so there was some kind of consecutive translation suddenly starting. There was a whole bit of confusion. The Chinese president didn't answer first. There was another question from a Chinese person, which was going on. And then a bit later in the interview, one of the American reporters had asked, well, but you had been asked a question by my colleague, you hadn't answered it. So the interpreting became an issue, became a topic in the question-answer session. And then in the news reports, I'll just show you two examples here. So you see here in The Guardian reports that who normally sticks to delivering speeches faced a rare unscripted moment in the press conference. Asked by a US reporter about human rights, Obama gave a lengthy reply, but who embarrassingly refused to answer. So it's also, I think it's a form of positioning in a news report by adding an evaluation. So it also presents the Chinese president in a particular kind of negative way in this news report here. Later at the press conference, another US reporter asked why he had not answered the human rights question, who laughed and blamed the problem in translation, saying he had not realized the question was aimed at him, but he would not now answer it. Yeah? So also the way how a journalist, as the agent of positioning then, uses language to put the politician in a particular light can be seen here in the use of the adverbs and the choice of the words, laughed and blamed the problem. And then in the Washington Post, you have something similar. Also the choice of the headline, he meets the free press. So the implication is there is no free press in China. The Associated Press fellow asked a gutsy, forceful question. So a gutsy, forceful is also kind of positioning the journalist as somebody who has a particular powerful relation. So when you think about how the interaction between the journalist and the politician is constructed in these news texts here, you also see a kind of different status. I would like to give, and would like to give you a chance to respond. Obama answered, the translator translated, and we know in the media, translation, interpreting, they always mix it up. It should be interpreting, but so be it. All eyes turned to who said nothing. Instead, he looked to a woman from China, Central Television, the state-run network that answers the Communist Party's propaganda department. It's also positioning. Yeah? You position a journalist as belonging to a particular media agency, which state-run answers the Communist Party's propaganda department, is also a way of kind of putting this journalist, this Chinese journalist, in a particular light. Yeah? Who tossed him a softball about friendship and mutual understanding. The next questioner, Bloomberg's Hans Nichols, gave you a lesson in press freedoms. First off, my colleague asked you a question about human rights, which you did not answer. The lanky newsman advised the Chinese strongman. I was wondering if we could get an answer to that question. In Beijing, that impertinence would get a reporter jailed, but who wasn't in Beijing? During the translation of Nichols' question, who held a palm up and smiled as if he couldn't see what the fuss was about? Because of the technical translation and interpretation problem, I did not hear the question about human rights. He explained falsely, as it turned out. So the event happened. There was some mix-up between translation and with the interpreting provision. It was done for the statements, but then when the question-answer session started, there was no interpreting first. It then came up, was done consecutively, but then you see how in the press conference, this kind of positioning the politician, and also here positioning the journalists themselves, is done via the choice of particular ways of language, adverbs, particular verbs, which we see. Also what we see here, it's an article in English. We read in direct speech marks what the Chinese president said, who spoke Chinese. Yeah? So that's something quite normal when we read news reports. We get direct quotes from politicians, which are not their own words in their own language, but it's the word of how what the Chinese politician said had been interpreted at this particular press conference. And this is quite normal. Just show you another example. And it's not just one event, but very often in news reports you hear different voices. Direct speech, indirect speech. North Korea could be preparing to conduct a fourth nuclear test. South Korea's unification minister said on Monday. It doesn't tell you when and where this was said, exactly, apart from Monday, and in which language. He told a meeting with MPs at the National Assembly. They probably spoke Korean. The Yonhap news agency said, so a news agency reporting about an event. His comments came after a South Korean newspaper quoted an unnamed government source as saying, the Allies would respond to direct speech more forcefully than in the recent past, but in a limited way. The New York Times said, citing Pentagon officials. So it's all kind of mediated. You have different sources included in one article, which come from different languages, sometimes acknowledged what the source is, sometimes not. The article continues then. The Chinese president, Xi Jinping, not sure, anybody Chinese? alluded to North Korean provocation when he said, no country, direct quote, yeah? He said, should be allowed to throw a region and even the whole world into chaos society. In a speech on Sunday, did he speak English? Probably not. Yeah? In a telephone conversation with UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon at the weekend, China's foreign minister said, in which language did they talk? Did they have a direct telephone conversation? Was it interpreter mediated? One interpreter, two interpreters, where was the interpreter sitting? In a different place? Telephone interpreting, what we can do these days, it's all very, very kind of complex, according to the ministry's website. So in news reporting, it's quite common that different sources are cited. The original source explicitly indicated in detail or not, sometimes just a general reference, and no indication whether this was the original speech in the original language or whether we read a translation. And we don't know if it is a translation, who had provided this translation in the news articles. And again, this kind of positioning according to the website. So here it's kind of like a neutral positioning when we said before the state-run communist propaganda website, so it's a political positioning. So in news reports, when we have these kinds of examples, it may be that the journalist used the interpreter's words, that the journalist was present at the press conference in person, or was listening to a press conference via TV or internet, recording it. It may be that they used official translations, so websites of governments very often put their own translations of a speech on the website, so it's kind of an official translation produced by the original government. But also very often we have journalists themselves being translators. So using, if they have foreign language competence, using the foreign text and producing their own versions in English or Hebrew or whatever their language is. Or there may be other options how language or foreign language is dealt with in news reportings. Just want to give you a few examples, for more recent examples here, which can repeat this. A government statement read out by the TV presenter quoted the country leader Kim Jong-un. I think that's the latest kind of development in North Korea with the rocket testing. Yeah? So quoted the Chinese leader as saying, now we have finally realized the great historic course of completing the state nuclear force, the course of building a rocket power. Again, quoting in English, but he had been speaking in Korean. Kim oversaw the launch of in Pyeongchang, about 80 miles north of the capital. The official KCNA news agency said the missile was more sophisticated than any previously tested and was capable of carrying a super large heavy nuclear warhead. Again, this the official KCNA news agency. Yeah? So that's the official North Korean news agency, and by calling it the official as North Korea, you also kind of position this particular news agency in a particular political perspective. I've put this super large heavy nuclear warhead in red here because they refer to the news agency KCNA. This news agency also has text in English. There were 2 articles on 29th of November referring to this particular event, which have just been reported about. And in both articles, they speak of super heavy nuclear warhead. Super heavy. So even if they say quoted from KCNA, it was not exactly the same wording as was put on the website of the news agency they had used for their news report. Which again kind of makes you wonder, why do we have sometimes slightly differences in the news report, even if they acknowledge a particular news agency as their source. CNN also had reports about this event, and in the CNN article they speak of the super large heavy warhead. So when we have The Guardian, which we had shown you here, it may well have been that instead of going directly to the KCNA website, they used the CNN news report, which had referred to the KCNA, and took the wording from there. So kind of interaction between different sources without necessarily always openly acknowledging where the source comes from. The country's state media made the announcement. That's again this kind of what I said, this political positioning. So you adding a slant, don't take this news agency too seriously because it's a state-owned one. State news agency, KCNA, called its new missile the most powerful ICBM and said it meets the goal of the completion of the rocket weaponry system development after the launch. Kim said, again you have Kim said, but he had been speaking in English, according to KCNA, so you have the official translation of this. In this case here, the red quotes meets the goal, finally realized it's exactly the wording from the KCNA. So in this case, CNN had taken the sentences from the English translations of the North Korean website. But we also have articles in Germany, in the German media, about this particular event. And you have this quote in red, that's the same one in red here. The historic course, so the second quote here. But there is nothing in German on the KCNA website. So it's a German news article referring to this Korean website, the Korean state-owned news agency, quoting in speech marked as a direct quote. But it's somebody must have turned this English text on the website into German. Who was it? The journalist? Probably in this case, yes. Because very often, as I said, it's journalist, but not the journalist who knows Korean, but the journalist who knows English, who used the English version, or a news agency for producing their own German text here. So recently I did a case study with a colleague in Japan, where we looked at the official statement by the Japanese Prime Minister commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Japan. So whenever there's specific anniversary, so the Japanese Prime Minister would make an official commemorative statement. And so in this he spoke in Japanese. There was an official translation into English being done by the Japanese government, or their translation department of the Japanese government. And we noted there were particularly two quotes which had been picked up. We compared then news reporting in English-speaking and German-speaking newspapers about the speech by the Japanese Prime Minister and see how the journalists had dealt with this particular speech. And there were particularly two quotes which all newspapers, or 90% of all newspapers, had reported verbatim or as indirect speech. The first one was this one here, where the official translation reads as, Japan has repeatedly expressed the feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for its actions during the war. Deep remorse and heartfelt apology were the kind of key phrases. And we noted that in the German newspapers there was more variation of how these quotes had been dealt with. So this heartfelt apology, deep remorse, so you have tiefe Reue, von Herzen kommende Entschuldigung, Bedauern, empfundene Entschuldigung. So I put it in bold. So Reue, Bedauern, for remorse, apology, the adjectives here. So differences. Some newspapers refer to DPA, which is the German news agency, as their source. But even those which did refer to DPA had sometimes slightly different wordings. So no consistency. The English newspapers had all used the official English translation. Only one, even in the German Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, they had 3 articles referring to this particular speech, and in 2 of them they used slightly different wordings for this particular phrase with the deep remorse and heartfelt apology, with the same journalist given as source, but different wording. So all the English newspapers had used the official translation. The other official quote was, we must not let our children, grandchildren, and even further generations to come who have nothing to do with that war be predestined to apologize. That's the official translation. Again, the English newspapers used the official translation. The only difference was in the Times, where it read, who have nothing to do with that war, be destined to carry the burden of apology. So it's not totally different, but it's a slight different word, so not using the official translation. Again, here the German newspapers, much more variation in dealing with this particular second quote here. So this English form here, as my Japanese colleague tells me, was closer to the original Japanese text than the official English translation. We also tried to contact journalists, so for those articles where the name of a journalist had been given, we contacted them. 2 replied, most of the others didn't reply at all. And the journalist for the Times, Richard Lloyd Parry, said the following then. And we asked him why he had not used the official translation. And then he replied, my personal policy is that when statements, answers to questions, or other utterances are made in Japanese, then as far as possible my job is to report on the content of the original, not on someone else's translation. In practice, supplied translations are often very useful and welcome and save a lot of time. I rely on them most days. But with something as important and politically charged as Abe's statement on the war, there was no question. We had to go to the original Japanese, scrutinize it closely for subtle shades of meaning and nuance, and compare it closely to the Japanese used in previous such statements. So he has some Japanese. This also said that he is working with another colleague who is a native speaker of Japanese, so that they tried to go close to the original message here. A bit like our traditional understanding of translation, you have to be as exact to the wording. Yeah? But it's what he says here, this is a politically charged nature of words. And it's a kind of a discourse. So whenever there is particular occasion of commemorating, so also the prime ministers use preset formulations. So this deep remorse and heartfelt apology, or the Japanese words, have been used by Japanese prime ministers over the last 20 years. So there is this, what people expect. So if you change, if you say something differently, then people become actually say, oh, He didn't use this word. Is there a new policy? Is there something else going on? And also the official English translations have stuck to this phrase of deep remorse and heartfelt apology. So which is also then kind of repeated in the discourse. One of the German journalists told us that because she has been living in Japan, she has also some Japanese. She says, I speak it fluently, it's your own yours. And said that in this case, very often she would translate from Japanese herself or refer to English translations prepared by the Japanese government. That's what I said before, so with the CNN and The Guardian. So that text produced by a news agency often serve or function as input, as sources for journalists, so they do not necessarily go back to the original, but use a text in another language. So this German journalist also said, well, there is a professor of Japanese studies, and he also sometimes produces translations of statements, and he had done the translation of this statement by Arber, which we found on the website. So this first quote, the official translation was, Japan has repeatedly expressed the feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for its actions during the war. This professor had translated, is a literal back translation then, as our country, so instead of Japan, our country, has, because of its conduct in the last war, repeatedly expressed the feeling of deep remorse and heartfelt apology. So you see there's a syntactic change, has because of its conduct, so the subclause comes earlier. And this literal back translation, or this German translation here, is closer to the original Japanese one. So also the use of our country instead of Japan. So in the official translation, our country had been reproduced or replaced by Japan, which all newspapers had set up. So this also made us wonder then, when German newspapers referred to the news agency DPA as their source, but DPA had used this Japan instead of our country, so also DPA cannot have done it from the original Japanese, but must have used the English news text or the agency report or the official English translation as their source. So translation or news translation, the research into news translation is relatively recent. It started about 10, 15 years ago. There's this book by Bielsa and Weizman, Translation News Agencies. Roberto Valdeon recently published an article in Perspectives about 15 years of researching news translation. And what has been identified so far is news translation is a very complex phenomenon. We have multiple sources, so it's not one source text, one target text as in traditional translation. We have multiple sources. They can be in multiple languages from different sources, different authors, different genres, as I have shown you in some of the examples. So we rarely have a complete source text and a complete target text which we can compare to what we normally do in translation if we want to identify particular strategies. Translation is hidden in the text production process, and very often the language versions are produced by the journalists themselves, multilingual journalists, and so translation is entwined with every aspect of news production. Journalists would not call themselves translators. So say, we are not translating, no, we are producing texts. So translation is this kind of literary production, we are writing for our authors, for our readers. So we do find transformations in news translations, omissions, additions, restructuring, which are determined by the purpose, the institutional practice and policies, and governed above all by the values of journalism. Speed, so news has to be out quickly. There's no time for checking and revision. Readability, also cultural acceptability, desirability, specific cultural sensitivities. It's this translation then. So the example I showed you. Can we speak of translation if there is no one source text, one target text? Or should we use another term? Trans-editing is a term which has often been used by people who look into news translation. This is a term which was initially suggested by Karen Stetting back in '89, but not for news translation, but she wanted to account for the fuzzy border between translating and editing. And she has actually said that there are 5 cases where trans-editing is practiced. Subtitling, shortening of passages. And news is just point 4, journalists drawing on material in other languages for writing their own text. It's just one of the cases which she gives as an example of this trans-editing. So is there help for research in using trans-editing instead of translation? And if we adopt a label like trans-editing when we talk about news translation, what does it mean for our concept of translation? Are we then not back to say, well, translation is the real thing, so the close equivalent reproduction, everything else needs a different label. So what about all our development in the discipline, which I mentioned some slides before, when we look at social practices and so on. So just to give you another example, when we talk about who are agents or journalists as agents of positioning here, there was an interview which the German Chancellor gave to several European newspapers, LP Spain, the Polish one, the Guardian, La Stampa, Le Monde, and the Süddeutsche Zeitung. As it turned out, the interview was conducted in German only by 3 journalists. The Polish one, the German one, I can't remember what the third one was. And there was a translation into several other languages was produced by the official translation department of the German Foreign Ministry. The Guardian article had as a heading, the German Chancellor speaks candidly to the Guardian and 5 other European newspapers. So it gives the impression that the Guardian was there interviewing Merkel with the others. I contacted the journalist then, and he replied back saying, unlike the Franco-German papers, we do not usually run straight questions and answer interviews, but we take the transcript and decide what the news or story or the interest is. It's again just like the journalist as an agent of positioning politicians, selecting messages, also the way how the text is constructed puts up a kind of relationship between the reader and the audience. So question, then come back to Elda's definition. Positioning involves assignment, shaping and negotiation of reciprocal relations between all parties involved in interaction. So is this, what I've seen in the news reports, is this a form of positioning, or is it not rather something of framing? So when we say reference to the state-owned propaganda news agency, or this politician refused to answer, or these kind of events, I would say, well, it is a kind of framing, but it's also a form of positioning. So it's not direct interaction in the sense like you've analyzed with dialogue, with interviews, with dialogues, but it's a wider dialogue or metaphorical dialogue, because you also have a relationship between the journalist and the readers, and by extension also a relationship is established between the readers, or is expected to be established between the readers and the politicians which are represented in the text. So it may be another form of positioning. You might want to contradict it or not. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Comment or ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Or we are waiting for the coffee break and you talk to me. I think they were waiting for the coffee. Coffee. Oh no, there's one.
You just sent me back 15 years when I worked, 20 years when I worked for a newspaper as a translator in Haaretz. And there would be an interview with some American official, and I had to translate it from the Hebrew, and I realized that I had to have the original English because it would be back translated. And most of the journalists I called, they didn't record it. They just took notes in Hebrew while the Secretary of State or whoever it was speaking, and I had almost no recourse to getting, so I would write it in without quotations because it was very, they had a very cavalier attitude to the need to have the original in English or anything like that. So. And I noticed also that the CNN had a deadline in Washington for the report in Japan.
Exactly. Yeah, it's true. But it's always then going for the indirect voice is a safer option then. Because then the content is probably still
If
the
you're
same,
aware
but
of
it's
the
not.
importance.
Yeah. And we have run several panels on news translation at translation conferences recently. But then at translation conference, you talk to your own group of people. So we had tried to have one panel where we wanted to invite journalists or people from media studies. So it was good to have had 3 or 4 researchers from media studies, because their perspective was very useful. But journalists themselves was a bit like, oh no, I'm too busy. I have to do this interview, I have to do this report, why should I go to a conference? But that's something we are still trying to get closer contacts with the journalists themselves, because a lot of it's what we say is kind of speculation. You see something in the text, and also what I said with what are the data, what are we dealing with? So there are certain limitations. You can analyze certain things, and then you see, okay, this is what I see here, but you don't know why was it done. Was it a journalist? Was it a reviser? Was it a space limit? Who had the final word? I talked to an interpreter once and saying, well, it's your words which show up in all these transcripts. Can you look at the transcripts before they are put on the website? No. So there's no time, it needs to be up there immediately. So sometimes I would like to have another chance to see, well, I would have said it differently, but that's the practice.
It goes on live. You interpret
Exactly.
on CNN as press conference live. That's it. It's your voice.
But that makes it interesting for research as well. That's why I think we should talk about it as translation and interpreting, not trying to find different words, because it's interesting for us to find out something more about the practice, what happens in the practice of translation and interpreting. Elda.
Well, I liked very much your talk, and I liked the discussion of the apologies there, and I'm sure that Zohar can contribute there, because, he's done a lot of work on apologies. It's an excellent example of a case where by reframing you reposition the speakers, because by re-editing the apology and adding just a very small nuance, but it's a very determinative nuance. You reframe the source as either a weaker apology or non-apology or whatever. And there are some discussions later over the question, was there an apology or not? So this would be reframing. And by reframing it as an apology or non-apology or weaker or stronger one, you reposition all participants, the original, the source speaker, of course the interpreter, and the recipients and everyone else. So into the introduction of reframing into the notion of repositioning.
Thank you. Thank you. Coffee. Coffee.